Welcome to the Anti-Bias in Children's Literature Workshop. My name is Lynette Mariasi, and I am the coordinator of the Family Resource Center at Pennsylvania School for the Deaf here in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Before we begin this workshop, I do have some housekeeping items to discuss. This is a Zoom webinar, so you will see several buttons on the bottom of your screen. These buttons include chat, Q&A, and live captioning or transcript. And again, those are all located on the bottom of your screen. Please use the chat box for technology-related questions, such as, I can't see the presenter. And you can also use it to interact with Victorica during the presentation. The Q&A box, please use that for questions that you have for Victorica during the Q&A portion of this workshop. If you'd like to have the captioning on, you can turn the subtitles on. However, do be mindful that it is auto-generated, so I can't vouch that it'll be accurate. You can ask Victorica questions throughout the presentation, and I will join Victorica at the end and share your questions with her. If you prefer to use ASL to ask your question, then please type ASL question in the Q&A and I will call your name when ready. You will need to wait for PSD to enable your camera so that we can, and we appreciate your patience while we do so. Now, Victorica Monroe, a Mississippi native, is the Chief Executive Officer and Educational Consultant of the Monroe Pedagogy Company. With over 15 years of experience in deaf education with a heavily transformative justice focus, she brings a wealth of knowledge in equity, diversity, and inclusion in ASL, English Bilingual Deaf Education, and works closely with deaf programs, organizations, universities, and colleges and businesses. With that, I am pleased to welcome Victorica. Please join us. Hello, everyone, and good morning. I know that it's Saturday, so I want to thank you for making time to attend this workshop today. So thank you so much for being able to attend. The purpose of this workshop is really to benefit our children. And when I say children, I mean students. I know that you may see me sign children throughout this presentation, but really I'm talking about our students. All right, so I want to thank you, Lynette, for that wonderful introduction. Today's topic is anti-bias in children's literature. And I may abbreviate literature as LIT as we move through the presentation. But what does anti-bias mean, and how do we identify it in children's literature? And once you do that, what will you do? This is especially important for families and caregiving communities who work with children. Before I begin, I want to go over some housekeeping to make sure that we have common ground. You can see I've listed several out here on the slide. And these common ground rules is something that I really love because it allows us to kind of let go of that hierarchy control and instead agree upon things as a group before we move forward. So firstly, I have listed is to learn authentically. I really encourage you to approach this workshop with an open mind and to engage in curiousness. Be respectful to others, of course. And then 3, also have an open mind and an open heart. There are several people who are coming with a more progressive mindset, and so I just encourage everyone to be open. Fourthly, to be mindful. When making comments, please be mindful of your attitude and behavior. Now, the next one is a disclaimer. I will be authentic and raw in my sharing today and in my comments, and some of these comments may cause you discomfort, so just a little disclaimer about that before we get any further into the presentation. Number 7, unfiltered transparency. I'm not going to sugarcoat things or downplay them or be obscure in my speech. What I will do is be authentic and honest in my presentation of facts. And this type of unfiltered transparency is vital to a healthy discussion of this nature. Next, I have to really be aware that your journey and process may not be the same as others, and we all have different ways that we observe and that we process information. Everyone's process is different, but really the goal is to have a collective understanding of the nature of the content. And then our last role is to engage in self-care and to make sure that your mics are muted. Now, the objective of today's workshop is to examine the different ways that anti-bias comes about in children's literature. And I'm sorry, just 1 second. Let me adjust my chat window. Okay, I'm back. So firstly, we have to look at positionality. Really, before you begin this work, you have to take an inventory of who you are and who you're engaging with. Your position takes into consideration your entire history, really. So when I say examine your position, what I mean is, take myself, for instance. I am a Black deaf person who is a part of the LGBTQ community, and I am genderqueer. Now, that identity is going to be brought, is what I'm using as my lens when I'm reading children's literature, or really anything, not even just children's literature. And so I must be mindful of my position because it's constantly influencing how I'm interpreting these texts. And so you always have to consider what is your position before you begin reading any type of children's literature. Secondly, it's critical that you understand the narrative and what it's reinforcing. So with children's lit, or even young adult or adult literature, you have to ask yourself, who is the narrative talking about? And I put this question to you now. Let me know in the chat what you think about children's literature. Whom do or what do the narratives most often center? So please share your answers in the chat. Any ideas about who or what children's literature commonly centers? I would say that most children's literature hyper-focuses on whiteness, and many of these narratives portray whiteness as being better, really reinforcing white supremacy. And so these texts depict white people, white things, white books, and white ways of living. Now, there are a few truly great books out there that I can recommend, many which you may not be aware of or may not know of, and I'll explain why many of the children's books that are out there are not so great. So I'm going to show a few popular books on the screen, and let me know in the chat if you've heard of them or if you've even read them yourself. So has anyone read or heard this book before? I see a lot of yeses. Yes, Cat in the Hat. Okay, more yeses coming through. So you've seen or read this book before. And so how many of you all were aware that the cat character in Cat in the Hat is actually a depiction of a common character from minstrel shows where blackface was used? And the author, Dr. Seuss, took his cues from those racist characters to form the character Cat. In fact, Dr. Seuss himself was racist, and his artworks to this day are still being used in racist ways. And we've seen this play out in Japan. If you're familiar with instances in which artwork is really used to oppress others and used to make fun of others, that has been done with his work. Often, you also may be aware of the story Green Eggs and Ham. That's another popular Dr. Seuss book. And you may have enjoyed the story without recognizing or realizing that the book really heavily promoted bullying amongst other negative behaviors that are present. And so, to anyone who remains on the fence of whether or not they should continue to celebrate an author such as Dr. Seuss, which, he is very celebrated here in America, I would ask you to look past the seemingly innocuous story and look deeper at what his narratives imply, because they're riddled with isms. I think we should instead celebrate marginalized authors and put our energy into books that center marginalized stories. Why do we have to, instead of we see racist authors like Dr. Seuss being hallmarked in tons of storybooks that promote whiteness and white supremacy, how can we change the narratives, especially within our children's literature? And I'll get more into that later. Cinderella is another one. How many of you all are familiar with that story? It's a very popular one. If you know it, it's about a girl who becomes a princess. At one point in the story, she loses a glass slipper, and the plot goes on. But I've actually noticed that there are a lot of issues within this story that are kind of swept under the rug. And true of many Disney stories, it's an oppressive one that is rampant with sexism. It's got that damsel in distress storyline where the princess is, waiting for a man, and in this case, she's waiting for a king to come and save her. And in reality, the Disney company is a very oppressive corporation that produces many of these types of stories with hidden isms. Even if you look at the Disney story, The Princess and the Frog, that has a common trope in it because it presents the dangerous narrative that the prince was ugly, he was also black in this case, and so it's drawing those correlations, and these hidden messages are being consumed and emulated by our children. They're stressing the importance of beauty, that value only comes with beauty, and to be beautiful you must be white. It encourages children to want to dress a certain way. It normalizes the masculine kind of saviorship complex that we see with the damsel in distress storyline. Beauty and the Beast is another one that pushes these kinds of narratives. And I don't know if you all can guess the next one, but Curious George is another very popular children's book. And I'm wondering how many of you all are familiar with that one. You've probably seen his face before. He is, always getting into trouble. But he too is a racist character, and I'll tell you why. When Curious George's character is introduced, the author is sure to mention that he is, remind you, a monkey, but that he is from Africa. Now, looking more deeply as to why they felt the need to pick or even mention Africa, we can see the subliminal analogy being drawn between monkeys and the black continent of Africa. So can we throw out these characters, these children's storybooks that have these types of negative perceptions and storylines of people and groups? Let me know in the chat if you think that these types of narratives should be thrown out. And double check in the chat, see if we have any responses yet. Okay, and it looks like nothing yet, and that's fine. You don't have to answer. But I would like you to think about how you view these narratives and consider how you could reframe when reading these types of stories. When you come across a children's storybook that is often looked at as good or, a really positive text, take it and sit down with your students and talk about why the book actually isn't all that great. Getting children to think about this early on is going to instill in them the awareness that they need to avoid falling for these common racist and biased tropes. They'll then start to notice that these tropes are in other places as well, not just children's narratives. And you can really use old text, you can use current text for this exercise, but the point is to really get the student to start to think about these things. Some people even say that Curious George is a great children's series, but that's simply just not true. It's riddled with racist metaphors, which I'll continue to discuss during this workshop. And so, moving on, there are 10 quick ways that you can use to analyze a children's book for racism and sexism. When you're looking at a children's book illustration, I want you to start noticing what roles women are typically seen doing. I can say it's usually something tied to cleaning or taking care of the home. They're the caregivers of the family, the ones who are feeding the children. Whereas the men are drawn as working men, who come home from a long day's of hard work. They come home, relax, they take a load off, quite expectedly so. And they're only really seen helping in the home upon request of a female character. And so the female character in these stories are typically cisgendered. They And their lives are usually all about taking care of their families. And so this is why it's important to take a look at the illustrations, check them and see what type of perceptions are being perpetuated through the pages. Are there negative narratives being pushed about marginalized groups? Keep an eye out for the token marginalized character seen amongst a sea of white ones. See if you can find any characters represented with disabilities, and take note, are they even prominent characters in the storybook? Of course, I was not able to cover all of the books here. I mentioned about a handful of them because there are so many out there. But really, when you look at it, all of these stories tend to omit certain members that we see in our actual society. They're made to be invisible in these storybooks. For example, families who live in rural areas, or blue collar workers, people who work in just regular jobs like transportation or other professions that aren't seen as prestigious as, white collar jobs where a lot of money can be made. And so, we tend to focus just on a certain subset of workers rather than looking at all of the different professions that this world has to offer. Just a second. Okay. And then homelessness. Those without homes are often missing from the pages of these children's books as if it were a taboo topic. But people can find themselves homeless for many reasons. Perhaps it's due to mental health, or they're just unable to access government assistance. Really, the list goes on. Yet, even though many people are experiencing homelessness, I bet you wouldn't really be able to think of a children's book that focuses on this topic, even though it's a very common experience as we can see it. And so I'm wondering if anybody in the audience has come across a great children's book about homelessness. You can drop the title in the chat if you know of one. Because we all know that the world isn't perfect, yet these children's stories push this untrue narrative that by removing certain people and experiences from the picture, they draw this world in the story world that's perfect, whereas that's not truly the case. Caregivers with incarcerated persons is another group often made invisible in children's text. Some of our children may be experiencing life without their parent, or, an uncle or another family member who's currently incarcerated. And too often, incarceration is a taboo topic that leaves our children confused about the system, maybe misinterpreting it and thinking that only bad people are incarcerated when truly an innocent person can be sent to prison. But because it's not a topic that is often talked about or discussed or, even mentioned in children's stories, that misinterpretation or misunderstanding of the system can be seen. People of Middle Eastern descent, like Arabs, are rarely mentioned. When we talk about caregivers who practice Islam, that's another group that's not there. Even trans people, LGBTQ plus members are often made to be invisible in children's narratives. The next way you can analyze a children's book for racism and sexism is to check the storyline and relationship between the people and the characters. For example, many of us love, and myself included, I love the series The Berenstain Bears, but it practices racism, sexism, and a lot of other isms as well, and reflects the negative societal perceptions that are so rampant around us. And it wasn't until actually last year that I realized how bad this book series actually is. And so one of the storybooks within this series is about the son who comes home one day to an angry parent who ends up berating them because the boy was getting poor grades. But the parent never actually considers that maybe there are other challenges there. Maybe the boy is struggling to understand the content, or he's experiencing mental health challenges. Instead, it presents a very old-fashioned way of perceiving and handling the situation. And so again, checking the storyline and relationship between people is something else you can do to analyze these texts. Moving on to the next, messaging is something that you could use to analyze it. What metaphors or beliefs are being reflected in the narrative? Like in Curious George, giving George an African origin, making the connection between a black continent and monkeys. That's a very kind of subliminal message there. And of course, the author of this series is white. So, and if you know anything about the history of blacks in America and how they were called monkeys as insults and, taunting them, that's a very strong correlation that's being made when they give George this sort of African origin. You may have even read the story of Rapunzel, the story of the girl with the long blonde flowing hair, and she would twist her hair, throw it out the window, and let the king climb up to come see her. I mean, that has been a story read by many children. And those who are struggling maybe with alopecia, you can see how that Rapunzel story may be triggering. They really highlight the beauty of Rapunzel's hair because it's so long and so luscious and so blonde. And then you have a child who's struggling with alopecia, that can be a huge disconnect. And so we have to make sure that we're emphasizing to our children that beauty and hair is not one and the same. You can be beautiful without having, that long flowing blonde hair. So really considering the effects on children's self and social identities. Going back to Curious George. Now, the author of that book series, Curious George, is white. So when we talk about looking at the perception of the author versus the illustration, we have to really look at that. If you look at, for example, books written about indigenous people, almost always the author is white, and there's always misinterpretations of the indigenous cultures and beliefs and how the native people dress and all of that. And many people make mistakes about it because they're not indigenous, and they still do even to this day. There's a very small percentage of books that are actually written by people. I want to say within the last couple of years, we've seen an increase, but there are still a very small percentage of books that are written and illustrated by BIPOC people. So often the illustration, how things are perceived in these books are unfortunately misconstrued. So like for some people, they may read Curious George and say, oh, well, Curious George is just a monkey. But once you understand the history about it, then you would know, as a Black author or a Black illustrator, then probably a monkey wouldn't be given the origin of African or what have you. Loaded words are another thing that we need to take note of. The saying, the boy was fat, or, fat and thin, fair and dark, black and white. So these different types of words, and because they're usually done in kind of a rhythmic manner, can really ingrain negative, oppressive type of beliefs within our children who are reading, consuming these books. So it's important that we as caregivers must be aware of what's going on. It's also worth looking at the copyright date. I know sometimes I'll read a book and it'll kind of perplex me, why did they write it this way? And then I'll look and see that it was written, back in the 70s or 80s. And it really reminds me back reading a lot of deaf-centered books written during that time that were just awful. They framed deaf culture inaccurately. They were filled with pity for the deaf community. There was a lot of paternalism within those pages. And so it's really important to look out for that. That medical perspective of deaf children is still very prevalent in older texts as well as newer texts. And so you may see storybooks reflect those same kind of through lines. So next up for analyzing a children's text is to really assess the appeal of the story and the illustrations. So you have your front cover, take a look at it, see what sticks out to you, what is the aesthetic. Often, one thing that we'll notice is that boys are given, blue things, whereas girls are given pink things. So that may be clothing, it may be toys. And so when I say really assess the illustrations, see how they are perpetuating those kinds of ideas to children that only boys can wear certain things or use certain colors, whereas girls must follow, a different set of rules. So when you see, and it's important to look at the cover because that's going to be the first thing that children see. So whether or not it's something that's at the forefront of their mind, when they're perusing these shelves and seeing all the boys dressed or acting one way and all the girls doing it another way, that's going to be a message that sticks with them. It's also important to look for children's books about children and adults engaging in actions for change, whether that be something related to religion or ethnicity, race, justice. There are many topics. But the point is to expose children in their youth. The younger the better, because children are already consuming messages that are, around us, that are shown to us every day. And so we can't take that approach that, oh, we just won't talk about it and hopefully they'll be fine, because they're eventually going to get to an age where they have ingrained in them all of these negative perceptions, which then translates to all the societal issues that we see nowadays. And kids are already, like I said, they're already living in the world. They're already seeing what's going on. And so what's the point of trying to hide from them these very important topics? Instead, we should sit down and talk with them about them, have age appropriate conversations, talk about, tie that to a storybook and have them see how the world around them is being presented in that storybook. And so I really encourage you all to do that. Now I want to talk about a metaphor that's used by Rudine Sims Bishop. So she talks about metaphor, essentially how the world is perceived by a white student or white child and how it's perceived by a marginalized one. So I'll go through each part of the metaphor. I have a different slide for each one. And so the first part of the metaphor is the mirror. So when we talk about identity, LGBTQ, white, black, privileged, wealthy, what have you. So really the point is and I'm sorry, let me clarify. When I say marginalized, I'm focusing right now on black and brown students. So we're comparing the two, black and brown students and then white students. So often when we look at stories, we will see that whiteness is prioritized and is focused, is shown within the pages. And really, we need to increase the number of black and brown characters within our stories, because the white child can pick up a book and see themselves reflected in it, whereas the black or brown, marginalized child is going to pick up a book and not have that mirror reaction. They're not going to see themselves within the pages. The next part of the metaphor is windows. So you have a white student, or rather you have a black or brown student who opens a window, looks outside, and doesn't see anything about their culture, doesn't see anything about them reflected out in the world around them. Whereas you have a white student who will open a window and say, yeah, no, I totally get all of this. It relates to my life. My neighbors look like me. And so when you have a child from both of those groups, marginalized and white, look at each other's lives and kind of learn from each other, then we can move on to the next part of the metaphor, and that's the sliding glass door. Now, this is where both a member of that marginalized group and a student from that white group will go out into the world together, in a metaphorical way. And because they have done all of this learning with each other through, looking through each other's windows, they are now more prepared to understand the world around them and to interpret it more accurately and to have that empathy. Now, there was an indigenous woman named Debbie Reese who actually added to Bishop's metaphor. She said that I like the metaphor, but she added curtains. I'll give you a second to read this excerpt here. And so really Debbie is talking about how she's fed up with the white supremacy that we see within our storybooks and just the prioritizing and of white characters. So when we talk about the curtains that she adds, really when you look through someone's window, it's just you looking. So if you're going to use that part of the metaphor without really understanding what's going on behind the window. And so rather than using that metaphor of the window, she adds on curtains, because that allows you to have a better understanding of not just seeing the thing that you're seeing, but understanding what it is that you're seeing, so that, again, empathy can be bred. And so now, how do we create an anti-bias library? This is something that you can set up in your home, in your school. Maybe you have a home office, an office off-site. Wherever you want to have it, you can have an anti-bias library. And so this is an example of a book that really focuses on activism. It's called Letters to a Prisoner. This is a really great book. It's written by someone who was formerly incarcerated. They themselves are an activist. And it's a children's book as well, so that's really great. Children can read and learn about activism from that book. Next, we have King and King. This is another storybook, and it's kind of a twist on the normal take of King and Queen, and this is focused on the LGBTQ plus community. We're seeing same-sex marriage become more accepted around the country, and so now we have the storybooks to follow that really show all the different members of societies, different types of people, and that's reflected here in the storybook King and King. So those who may not fit that stereotypical, king and queen type of storybook, they may not see themselves reflected in that. They can pick up this book King and King and see that there are different types of people in the world. There are different perceptions out there, and so they can see themselves in these pages. Anti-Racist Baby. This is teaching white kids. This is essentially a story for white kids. So it's exposing them again early on about race and racism. And this is one of my favorite books. And I don't know if you know, the author, Ibram Kendi, actually wrote the book, How to Be Anti-Racist. And so he's the author of this book. And so I highly recommend his work. A lot of people are unfamiliar with the Tulsa Race Massacre. And there's actually a lot of research done on this, but it took place on a place called Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I believe Tulsa, Oklahoma. And so this was an area that was very wealthy. There was no racism. Everything was going great, all until one little black boy was accused of doing something that he did not do, of rape or something of the sort. And so they ended up being, the area, which was a black area, ended up being gentrified and burned down. And so you can take a look at that book. Now I want to give you all just a moment to read this quote here on the screen. And so I'll read this out loud. It says, authentic literature refers to narrative and expository texts that are written in the original natural language of the authors. So that means if I was a writer as an LGBTQ person, I could write accurately and authentically a story about LGBTQ people rather than just making a bunch of things up, which is something that we often see. Now, some websites that I like to use to find these types of texts, like the ones that I shared toward the end of the presentation, are socialjusticebooks.com, teachingfortransformation.org. I use both of those websites a lot. I also use Rethinking Schools. They have great resources as well. I've actually read a lot of texts from those three sources, and I've enjoyed a lot of them. And some of them, I've learned things that I didn't know before. So that is the end of my presentation, and I'll toss it back to Lynn. Wow, what an informative and powerful presentation. I believe we can all agree that books are important tools to help children understand their homes, communities, and the world and people around them. Families, caregivers, teachers, professionals almost always read stories to children before they're able to actually read them to themselves. And so these stories often create or make memories. They make a big impression that can affect these children for a lifetime. It's a huge responsibility that many of us may not realize we have. Victorica has given us some tools to assess our children's books to make sure that they reflect the diverse groups of people around the world. I truly hope that we will be able to take away and benefit from this presentation the ability to confidently begin assessing these books for diverse characters, for racist, sexist, or stereotypical messages, and biases through pictures and words. I know many of you have questions or comments that you'd like to ask or share, so I'll go ahead and start now. Look at the Q&A. Again, you can sign your questions if you like. So give me just 1 second. Okay, so do you mind if the tech person can highlight both Victorica and myself? So I'll take the spotlight off, or spotlight both of us rather. Okay, can everyone see both Victorica and myself? Perfect. All right, looks like we're all set. So that was great. Obviously, some of the questions it seems like, may have been responded to during the presentation if they were submitted earlier. But there is a question from Amy. Amy asked, will you have any type of reference guide or, worksheet that we will be able to use so that we can go through as we're assessing our children's books, kind of like a checklist? And also, will this PowerPoint be available to us? And Victorica is answering, yes, I can go ahead and share resources with you all after this. Lynette's saying, okay, so can we actually save this PowerPoint and pass it along? Yes, okay, so a copy will be made, and I'll make sure to include a copy of this presentation as well in the email that I send out to all of the attendees. Okay, next, Andrea asked, do you have any top 10 favorite books that you would consider anti-bias? What are your favorite books? And Victorica's saying, oh, that's a hard question. There are so many. I've never actually thought about them, 1 through 10, but I really do enjoy King and King. That's a really good one. I like The Guide of Gender Identity. That's another one. King and King, actually, that story that I showed on one of the last slides, that's one of my favorites. It's just, honestly, I'm trying to think. There are so many books, it's hard to name them. So this is Lynette. Yes, and just encouraging people, you can continue to type your questions if you'd like, but if you want to sign your question in ASL, just type ASL question to ask, and then I'll call on you. We have an anonymously submitted question that said, do you think we should suggest to libraries to rearrange their books and eliminate certain books written in certain decades? So what's your opinion on that? Victorica here. I think we should keep them. What we have to do instead is reframe why the book is not a great book. It's impacted by racism, it has sexism. And so we just need to reframe how we're consuming these texts to help us better identify the difference between a good and a bad book rather than just eliminating the book altogether. Lynette saying, yeah, so it's all about those analysis skills. And Victorica saying, exactly, and it's a part of the history, and so we need to keep that. And this is Lynette, exactly, and so having children be able to develop their abilities to assess these type of texts, that's definitely a skill that children need to have as well. And so I agree with that, and I have another question that says, how can we reframe older books? So when we have these older books, how do we sit down and reframe them with children? Victorica here. Oh, think about the story, The Three Little Pigs. So you have on the cover, a picture of 3 little pigs. So you can ask the child, what do you see here? And have them explain, what they see. You see the word little, are the pigs the same as people? Do they consider the pigs animals? Do they consider them to be like a certain type of person? Is the wolf mean? Why do you consider the wolf to be mean? Is it because of his expression, or is that bad? Is it good to be mean? And so you can take different books and talk about these things. There are some animals that commonly some children are afraid of, even though the animal might not be a particularly vicious animal. But often we see foxes portrayed as villainous, whereas pigs are super sweet and nice. And so, really challenging those perceptions with our children and say, well, why do you think the wolf's bad? It's not because he's a wolf, but it's because, he's destroying these houses. And so, those are the types of questions that we can ask our children. Yeah, exactly. And so, we're getting rid of the stereotyping of certain animals by really reframing the conversation around why we have these certain perceptions about those animals. And I'm looking at the chat box right now. It's going crazy. A lot of love being shown for this discussion. They're saying, thank you. This is helping me understand how to reframe conversation. So just a shout out there to you, Victorica. Another anonymous question. It said that March 2nd, you may know, is Read Across America Day. Yep, and so it's coming up soon. And it's also, they said, a birthday of someone they know. And so they're wondering if they could change, rather than celebrate their birthday, if they could really focus on the value of reading and literacy. Oh, sorry, I didn't realize the interpreters were behind. Okay, just 1 second. I'll wait for them to catch up. Okay, looks like we're good. Thank you, interpreters. Victorica. Yeah, it seems like there's a lag, but I think they have caught up with us now. This is Lynette. No problem. I'll repeat the question. So March 2nd is Read Across America Day, and it shares a day with Dr. Seuss's birthday. And so the question is, should we not celebrate the birthday of Dr. Seuss, but instead celebrate the value of literacy and learning to read? And this is Victorica. Exactly. And when people ask us, I agree, I think we should. And when people ask why we're not celebrating Dr. Seuss, we should be able to explain because he's not a great person. And we have examples. We have, artworks of him that are making fun of certain groups, that his characters are really reanimated minstrel characters. And so instead of celebrating those types of people, Dr. Seuss, we can celebrate authors who are LGBTQ, who are Black and brown, who are from marginalized communities, and we should put the spotlight on them instead. This is Lynette. Exactly. So not only explaining to people why we shouldn't celebrate Dr. Seuss because he is a bad person, but then also giving them something else to do for that day by highlighting marginalized authors. And the next question is, how can students make sure that they are creating these types of anti-bias curriculums that include activism? Should we focus on challenging, we should focus on challenging, all of these isms, but how do we incorporate that into the curriculum? And Victorica is saying, honestly, I'm not sure. I think that's a big question. I always tell people, right, we're not going to change everything in a day, but we do need to start. We do need to start somewhere. And it's impossible to say that we'll be able to do everything within our lifetime, but we can have this good jump off point. We can sit down with our children. We can agree that there are certain types of implicit biases that are present within, society and within our schools, and we can address those as we see fit. And this is Lynette. Exactly. And we can draw like some type of hierarchy or, just how we want to tackle those things. And so another question I'm seeing is that there are a lot of English books at the library. Do you think that there should be more artists, deaf artists and deaf illustrators that are being, platformed in children's literature and that should be available in libraries? This is Victorica. Yes, I do. I think that there should. I think that's a great idea. I always want to see more deaf artists, more deaf, authors, illustrators, in all professions, really, without it being, that, oh, poor deaf person, here you can do illustrations for this book. I want us to be valued for our actual work. And I remember there was one deaf creator, and I'm not sure the name, but it was maybe 3 or 4 years ago. I remember seeing one deaf writer, but that was it. And so I think that we could definitely use more. This is Lynette. Do you have any recommended websites or stores that we can go to buy anti-bias books? This is Victor Rica. Yes, I'm going to share a resource list with you, Lynette, that you can share to the attendees. Lynette is saying, I'll compile a Google slide of all of the resources that are shared with me by Victor Rica, and then I'll forward that all to the attendees that are here today. So you can look out for that. And Rebecca asked, for all of us hearing people, I don't know if you'll be able to answer, but I did hear her name pronounced like 4 different ways. Are you sure we know how to say your name right? I want to make sure that we're saying your name correctly, Victorica. So how do you actually pronounce your name? Yeah, I'm not hearing, so I wouldn't be able to answer that question. I do know that, it can be pronounced differently depending on where you're from, but because I'm deaf, I wouldn't be able to answer that question. And it looks like Janet asked if you could, what's it say? Oh, yeah, if you could show us again those 10 quick ways to assess children's books. They were trying to note all of them down and wasn't sure if they had them down accurately. Oh, yeah, I can actually send those to you as well. And Lynette's saying, okay, perfect. I'll include that in the email that I send out to all of the attendees. And so, this is Lynette speaking. I think I touched all of the questions in the Q&A. Let me just check the chat box. There's just a lot of love being shown for you here, Victorica. Folks saying, thank you for helping us reframe this conversation, or reframe children's books and bringing this conversation to light, providing examples. People saying it's really great discussion. It looks like someone, last name Fleming, said that there was a deaf literature in Canada that was recently published. The interpreter missed the name of the book, but there was a recent publication from a deaf writer in Canada. All right, so it looks like we're out of time, so we're going to wrap it up. But before we close out, Victorica, do you have any final comments, last words, or thoughts you want to share with us? This is Victorica. Yes, I always encourage you all to, think about what you learned from this presentation and think about the words that you use as you move forward, because children, honestly, they're like sponges. They soak everything up, and it's important that we be mindful of what we're saying and what our children are consuming. So really the power of using books to teach our children, that is irreplaceable. So it's very important that we recognize that power. Absolutely. And children's stories are tools that shape our children's character, and it's a very strong educational resource that we need to acknowledge. So again, there's a lot of love for you in the chat. People saying thank you for bringing this conversation front and center. Someone else said this is a great workshop. I actually teach children's literature course in high school and college, and so I really appreciated this, and I bought that anti-bias book for one of my friend's children. Someone else said this is Chant. This is one of the best workshops that I've been to in a while. And so I want to say thank you from all of us, Victorica, for your presentation. And you can say that we are recording this presentation. So we're going to clean it up, add some captions, and put it on our school website. And so this will be available to everyone. I'm also going to share with you all the resources that Victorica shared in a separate Google Doc. So again, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Victorica, for all this valuable information. This is Victorica. I want to say one more. I want to thank the interpreters who were here today. We really appreciate all of your hard work and for working with us and being a part of the team. So thank you. And this is Lynette. Yes, thank you from us as well. And everyone, you have a wonderful day.